Right, thanks everyone for joining us in FST for our Science Week. It's been a great week so far. I hope I can live up to the great things that we've seen so far. You have to bear with me. I'm a little bit excited. I'm from Liverpool, and the notion of being able to speak to everyone in the world from my living room is a real excitement for someone from that neck of the woods. So I'm pretty excited about this. Dealing with the concept of change, we're all used to medicines in our life. And what I've done is I've given a title to kind of stimulate the discussion about what's going to happen with medicines in the future, because making medicines is a difficult business. The first thing I want to say, I'm going to mention a couple of times about vaccines. So vaccines, you will have all had a vaccine, or many of you will have had a vaccine soon, or recently, or will do soon. Let's be clear, vaccines present disease. Vaccines do not cause disease. There's no evidence to say that vaccines cause other diseases. I'll come back to that a few times. Coronavirus. I changed my talk a little because obviously this is something which has occupied most of our lives for the last 12 to 15 months. This is what coronavirus looks like. It looks kind of like a work of contemporary art to some eyes. It's essentially a sphere with these beautiful blue blooms on the top, which look a little bit like broccoli. Anyone under 15, don't be frightened. It's not broccoli. This is the so-called spike protein that attaches a virus to the surface of the cell, and it enables it to get this blue stuff, which is the information to make the virus, again, to clone itself into the cell. We'll talk about that in a moment. So that's what coronavirus looks like. 138 million infections around the world. These numbers are from yesterday. The data obviously goes up all the time. Sadly, 3 million deaths, each one a tragedy. But most people don't suffer major symptoms from coronavirus. 111 million people have recovered. That's a success story. How has science helped? Now, I think everyone believes that science has helped, but how has it actually helped? Well, let's focus in on the worst part of this, which is the deaths. Spanish flu at the top. This is the last time we had a situation like this more than 100 years ago. The estimates of deaths in Spanish flu range from a low end 17 million to the high end 100 million. Just to contextualize that 100 million in 1920 will be equivalent to 385 million people dead at current population levels. So science has done an awful lot by controlling the way we've lived, even though it's been painful, by devising vaccines and other treatments. So science has made a big difference. And of course, access to medicines is considered to be a human right. The World Health Organization states that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is a fundamental right without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So money shouldn't affect you getting access to medicines, but it does. I'm going to talk about how medicines are discovered, and it comes as a surprise to some people to know that doctors don't discover medicines. Of course, doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals are absolutely vital members of society. Merchant bankers have not got us out of this crisis. But doctors don't do experiments. People are pretty strict about doctors not doing experiments. Scientists carry out the experiments that identify medicines and then trial them and look at them in patients with doctors. So scientists discover medicines. I'll talk a little bit about how that happens. There are three broad types of medicines. Chemical molecules, chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is often associated with cancer. In fact, it's a broad term which refers to the use of any chemical, such as penicillin, to treat a disease. Vaccination, I've mentioned. Vaccination, get your kids vaccinated, get yourselves vaccinated. It's a safe process. It saves lives. The third strand, which is a relatively modern one, biotherapy, is where we use biological molecules such as proteins or genes, and we inject them into people, for instance, to replace missing biological products. Chemotherapy, though, represents 70 to 75% of medicines which have ever been made or which are currently in use. Now, of course, science is all about people. Let's talk about some people who have helped in terms of science. Well, let's first talk about achievements in science. The woman that left here is about 16, is Maria Sklodowska, better known as Marie Curie, the only person in the history of the Nobel Prizes to win a Nobel Prize for physics and for chemistry, a self-educated scientist. She was not allowed to go to university because women were not allowed into the education system. Her father stimulated her interest in science, and she proved herself to be pretty much a genius, a heroic figure in science. This is Sarah Hicks. I never knew Sarah Hicks. She died about 50 meters from me on this day in 1989 at a football game. Sarah was an undergraduate chemistry student at Liverpool University who turned down a scholarship at Oxford so she could go to Liverpool to watch her favorite football team. Who knows what this young scientist would have done? I often think about Sarah. I dedicate this lecture to her and pretty much everything that I do. The final thing that I want to show you is this dapper guy who looks like he should be from the set of Mad Men. This is Jonas Salk. So pretty dapper. Look at that tie. I like that safety pin. I'm not sure it's design, but it looks pretty sharp, doesn't it? Who's Jonas Salk? You may have heard of him, a landmark figure in medicine. Before I go any further, I'm going to show you this to do with Marie Curie and her father inspiring her. And I'm just going to park this here and point out that daughter's career aspirations are improved according to the amount of housework a father does. Bit left field there. That is a scientific fact. We can talk about that later if you want. Okay, back into the main theme of the talk. Jonas Salk was a vital figure in polio, the treatment of polio. Now, I'm about to show a photograph showing what polio does. So if you want to look away, if that would disturb you, please look away for about 10 seconds while I show this image. So the polio virus causes deformation in muscles and muscle development. And that is most often in skeletal muscle, but also in muscle that is involved in respiration. So people become either paralyzed or can't breathe with polio. This graph, they always say as a scientist, don't show anyone a graph. I don't care, I love graphs. Look at this chart. This shows that in 1950, there were around 60,000 polio infections in the United States. After 1955, when Jonas Salk delivered the first polio vaccine, there was a cliff edge decline, and now polio, domestic polio, is eradicated in the United States. A phenomenal achievement caused by vaccines. Vaccines are safe and effective. Now, more importantly, there's an ethics associated with medicine. Science shouldn't be about money. Famously, in an interview with Ed Murrow, the TV host, who asked who owned the patent to the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk said, the people. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? And I believe entirely with this. And this goes back to the World Health Organization declaration that economics shouldn't affect the right to healthcare. People should not disproportionately benefit financially from science. Okay, another really important thing which goes back to vaccines and coronavirus, the difference between a cause and a coincidence. When polio first became a problem, it was the 1920s in America. There was an explosion in cases. No one knew what caused it. No one really what was going on, but it affected hundreds of thousands of children around the world. And it obviously is a major problem. So people looked at lifestyles, and what they noticed was that certainly dietary practices correlated with polio infections. So they assumed, not unreasonably, that ice cream caused polio. If you look at this graph, this is a graph with the magenta boxes of ice cream sales against the black boxes, which are polio cases. Look at that match. But in fact, it's a coincidence because polio is caused by a virus that is best spread in warm, moist air, such as you might find at a public outdoor swimming pool. And of course, outdoor swimming pools used in summer months when ice cream sales go up. Do not confuse cause with coincidence. Any diseases which seem to be related to vaccines are not truly related. Last year, Africa was declared free of wild polio. This is an unbelievable medical achievement caused by vaccines. You'll all be getting your vaccines, take them. They will protect you to an extent against coronavirus. Because of all this great activity, people like scientists, they think they're pretty decent. This is an Ipsos Mori poll from last year showing, despite the fact that governments try to pin a lot of blame on scientists, pretty much 60% of civilians think the scientists are positively trustworthy. Only doctors and nurses rate higher. So thanks for that. And I think it's a merited trust. Okay, so what do we do? What do I do? Well, we try and learn from nature. So here's some chemistry. This beautiful molecule at top left is morphine. The red is oxygen, the blue nitrogen, dark gray carbon. Carbon tends to bond to itself and form rings. The pale gray is hydrogen. Now, although this is beautiful, it'd take us all day to draw it every time we wanted to. So what we've to come up with is this notation where we use lines to represent bonds. Bonds, think of two magnets joined together, that's a bond. You can pull them apart, you can put them together, and they'll stay together. Here is the rings that I'm talking about. Now, although that's a great drawing and means we can actually look at it, this is actually what morphine looks like. It's a T shape. And it turns out that fits perfectly into the part of the brain that controls pain perception. Okay, so now we know the structure as a chemist. What can we do? Here's morphine. What about if we take this part and this part, and we get rid of all the other shrubberies? So we did this in our lab. We take this compound, which we can get on the 100 kilogram scale, and we do one reaction and we make this compound. It looks a bit like morphine. Does it work in the brain? You betcha. What it does, it's an anti-Parkinson agent, and it does this by being a dopamine agonist. So that's what scientists do. We learn about facts around us. We try and do different things to be able to make things better for the world. I'm going to go back to coronavirus now. Loads of acronyms. Don't be bothered about that. You all use acronyms, LOL, CBA. You all know what acronyms are. So don't be worried when you see these things. I'll talk through them as you need to do them. So COV, coronavirus, polymerase chain reaction, DNA polymerase 1, lateral flow test, reproduction number, endoplasmic reticulum, AT1, AT1R, AT2, AT1 to 7, and then some acronyms that only 2 people in the world know about. Why do we need to know about those? Because they're all to do with proteins, and proteins are bosses in biology. The way proteins are made is from DNA. So we take an information source in DNA, we convert it into RNA. You've heard the DNA, I'm sure, perhaps not RNA. That's the message, and that enables us to make the product. And the reason that's important is that proteins do everything. They make the tea, they sweep the floor, they make the beds, They clean your teeth. Proteins are the mums of the biology world. A good way to kill pathogens is to stop their proteins working. And that's the way medicines work. Okay, so viruses are machines. They basically, this is another drawing of a virus. It's just a different representation. They get into a cell, they copy all the bits that they need to reassemble, and then they come out of the cell. And one virus can create hundreds or thousands of new ones, and they all go on and infect other cells. So that's how a virus can swamp the system. This is how complex things are. This is AT1, this is AT2, this is AT1 to 7. Ignore them, except that they cause potent biological effects. And when you take out the receptor which triggers those effects by binding the SARS-CoV virus to it, that stops the normal activity which keeps difficult processes at bay. So coronavirus does two things. It uses this to get it into the cell, but then it stops good things from going on in the cell. And that means that things which will cause damage or will enable things to go wrong are allowed to go wrong. So if I show you ACE2 is that receptor I just mentioned. It's involved in all sorts of things. It's involved in diuresis, thirst, brain control, the liver, the kidneys, all sorts of things. So coronavirus does two things. It makes itself and it stops protecting us. And that's why it induces a disease. How can we make medicines for COVID-19? Well, this is the general way we make medicines now. We have an idea. We make a molecule similar to the way that I just showed you. We then test it. We test it in test tubes in animals. No one likes testing in animals. It's a necessary evil. We can talk about that later if you want. It never works first time. So we go through this cycle, possibly for years, until a compound is identified which is safe and looks like it works. We then make 300 kilograms of it in a plant, and then an investigation application is filed with a drug regulatory agency. And then the second phase, clinical study starts, 4 phases, and eventually you end up with a medication. How long does it take? 7 years for the preclinical, up to 8 years, and it costs around $1 billion. The important thing to notice is that governments have decided that medicines are for-profit products. So in other words, it's a commercial practice. So a company is faced with 15 years to get to this stage with the possibility of failure. That's a lot of risk for $1 billion. We'll come back to that in a minute. And this is what the sort of thing looks like for coronavirus. 8,000 compounds gives you 246 so-called hits that look like there might be drugs. This would take 2 to 3 years normally. It's been accelerated because of the pandemic. Okay, so $1 billion to get to the stage where we might get approval. What are the chances? So these are the approval in the second phase, the clinical trials. If I show you immediately that the average success rate is 10%, and if we look at the right, oncology is 5%, so that's cancer. There are 5% success rates in clinical trials. So for an overall rate of 10%, we have to get one drug, we have to put 10 in. That's $10 billion with only one being approved. So that is a strange business model. Wait, there isn't big pharma bad, I hear some of you saying. All we hear about is companies being overcharged. And look at some of these numbers, 3 billion fines. But please notice that all of these are essentially about promotion and marketing and commercial activities. It's not to do with the science, but it's related to the fact that pharma is a risky business. It costs a lot of money to make money. Now, having said that, medicines are valuable. So here are the 10 most profitable companies in the US. And this reference down here, I'll give you a copy of the slides if you want them later on. So please contact me if you want to see those. These are the top 10 most profitable industries in the US. This article is about their impact on low-income people. Number 10, drugs and pharmaceuticals, 23% profit margin. That's a lot. Depressingly, tobacco is 37%. Water is 30%. I don't even know if that's possible. That's just not right. So there's a lot of money in this game. How much are medicines worth? Let's draw it back to something that we all know about. Many of you will have gold jewelry. The spot price of gold yesterday was $1,733 for a troy ounce. Troy ounce is about 31 grams, okay? If you look at this compound, which was Novartis's breakthrough multiple sclerosis drug, fingolimod or Gilenya, when it was introduced to the NHS, its cost was $8.6 million per troy ounce. So you're looking at something which is around 5,000 times more valuable than gold. Is that right? That's a good question. Why do medicines cost so much? And this graph on the final slide summarizes everything that I've just said. What we've got on the left is the early days of drug discovery. Drugs were not regulated at all until 1950. Think about that. Drugs could just go on the market without any testing. It's amazing we're not all dead. But what we have here is a logarithmic scale, which is the number of drugs per $1 billion spent in trying to make them through research. So in 1950, there are about 60 drugs per $1 billion. That has steadily declined until, and this is some time ago, it's now less than one drug per $1 billion. So you're looking at a business that has a 9.6% success rate in $1 billion investment. And so there are good economic reasons. Economists would argue that drugs are going to be expensive, continues to be expensive, and that may be why 21st century medicines are an endangered species. Thank you.